All right, today we're tackling the Frankfurt School, a group of thinkers whose entire legacy feels like a giant tug-of-war. Were they radical critics, locked away in some fortress of thought? Or were they supposed to be out on the streets, actually changing the world? So what's the real story here? Let's get into it. And let's just kick things off with this quote from one of the school's most famous members, Theodor Adorno. He was, to put it mildly, completely stunned by the student protests of the 1960s. I mean, here's a guy who spent his entire life building this powerful critique of society, what he called a theoretical model of thought. But he never, ever imagined people would try to turn his super complex ideas into action, with Molotov cocktails. This one quote just perfectly sums up the conflict at the very heart of the Frankfurt School.
And that conflict, really, it all boils down to this: the classic tension between theory and praxis. Karl Marx famously wrote that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. But the Frankfurt School, they kind of seem to flip that whole idea on its head. They were absolute masters of critique, of theory. But when it came to action, well, that's where things get a little complicated.
So this brings us to the first big knock against them, the accusation that they were all talk and no action. Just a bunch of comfortable armchair Marxists who got quiet when it really mattered.
And get this critique comes from a fellow Marxist, Georgy Lukács, and it is absolutely scathing. He accused them of living in a grand hotel abyss, basically saying they were enjoying fancy meals and high culture while philosophizing about the suffering of the world from a safe distance. For him, their brand of theory was just some elitist game, totally cut off from the real fight.
But Adorno and his friends saw it in a completely different light. For them, digging deep into theory wasn't some kind of cowardly retreat. No, it was a deliberate, principled withdrawal into a fortress of thought. They argued that in a world that had gone completely insane, maybe the only truly radical thing you could do was to think clearly, to resist the pull of conformity. For them, thinking was the action.
And to really get why they valued theory so much, we've got to go back to where they started. Because their entire intellectual project was basically born from this deep, profound sense of failure.
Okay, this is maybe the most important thing to understand about them. The Frankfurt School wasn't founded to kick off some new revolution. It was created back in 1923 for a very specific reason: to figure out why the German Socialist Revolution of 1919 completely fell apart. Why were workers, instead of rising up, getting drawn to consumer capitalism and, much more terrifyingly, to Nazism?
And this timeline, man, it really shows you just how dire their situation was. They were founded in the shadow of a failed revolution, and then their work gets cut short just 10 years later. As Jewish Marxist thinkers, they were public enemy number one for the Nazis. They had to flee for their lives when Hitler took power, scattering across the world into an exile that would, of course, profoundly shape everything they wrote.
And it's out of that experience, the horror of Nazism and being forced from their homes, that the school develops one of its most famous and, frankly, most chilling concepts.
They called it the authoritarian personality. While working in America, Adorno helped create this personality test. They called it the F scale. And yes, the F literally stands for fascism. The whole point was to identify the specific psychological traits that make a person susceptible to authoritarian ideas. They were trying to understand the enemy from the inside out.
So what does this personality type look like? Well, here's the profile they came up with. A person who is obsessed with the idea that tradition is declining. They can't cope with change. They have this deep-seated hatred for anyone they see as an outsider or part of an outgroup. And crucially, they're willing to take action, even violent action, to defend their worldview. For the Frankfurt School, this wasn't just a portrait of a Nazi. It was a warning sign about a type of person that could pop up anywhere at any time.
And here is where it gets really controversial. Adorno started to argue that he saw these exact same traits in the student protest movements of the 1960s. He felt their absolute certainty, their refusal to self-reflect, and their aggressive calls for liberating action reminded him of a new kind of authoritarianism. His colleague Habermas even went so far as to call it left fascism.
But, it wasn't just fascism they were worried about. They also aimed their critique at a much more subtle form of control they saw taking hold in Western consumer culture.
They came up with this brilliant term for it, the culture industry. It's the idea that our culture, movies, pop music, the media, it isn't really art. It's mass-produced, just like any other commodity. And its real job isn't to make us think or challenge us. It's to pump out standardized, predictable stuff that keeps us distracted, passive, and most importantly, obedient consumers.
This quote from their landmark book just nails it. The big promise of capitalism, right, is freedom of choice. But for the Frankfurt School, that was a total illusion. We think we're making a free choice, but we're really just picking between slightly different versions of the same pre-packaged product. It's an illusion that keeps the whole system humming along.
Now, fast forward to today, and this really complex legacy has been twisted into something completely unrecognizable. It's a dangerous conspiracy theory that tries to blame the Frankfurt School for pretty much everything wrong with the modern world.
So let's just break this down. Myth versus reality. The myth claims they were this secret cabal plotting to destroy Western values, promote political correctness, and tear down the family and the church. But the reality? Well, according to the sources, it's the complete opposite. They actually defended the family as a potential zone of resistance against state power. Habermas tried to form an alliance with the Catholic Church on social issues, and a later thinker, Axel Honneth, emphasized that equality before the law was absolutely essential for a free society. The myth just doesn't hold up to their actual work.
And look, this isn't just some abstract internet debate. This number, 77, that's how many people were murdered in the 2011 Norway attacks. The terrorist who did it left behind a 1,500-page manifesto, and in it he blamed cultural Marxism for what he saw as Europe's decline. It's a terrifying reminder that these conspiracy theories can have absolutely devastating real-world consequences.
So, if they weren't some shadowy cabal, what is their real legacy? What should we actually take away from their fortress of thought?
You know, I think this quote from Max Horkheimer just says it all. He wrote this as the darkness of Nazism was falling over Europe, and he saw their work as a kind of message in a bottle. They were sending it from their dark times, hoping it would wash up on the shores of the future, our shores. It's not a blueprint for revolution, it's a set of critical tools designed to help us recognize the threats to freedom in our own time.
Which leaves us with a question for right now, doesn't it? In our world of endless streaming content, infinite social media feeds, and nonstop products to buy, are we genuinely free? Or were the thinkers of the Frankfurt School right all along? Are we just enjoying the freedom to choose what is, in the end, always the same? Maybe it's a good time to open their message in a bottle.